The Corruption Tracker is a women and youth-led project that contributes to the dismantling of the arms trade through the lens of corruption. We expose this information to be an accessible tool to find and share information on how corrupt arms deals have affected countries and communities. The following webinar will focus on the wider context of harm caused by military partnerships with Egypt and other countries in the MENA region, and what military corruption means to Egyptian activists, and how we can build better relationships based on solidarity with the Egyptian people. Firstly, we would like to express our gratitude to all those joining us today, especially considering the challenging circumstances. We are aware that many individuals may be personally affected, either directly or through relations, by the ongoing in Gaza, and we acknowledge the profound emotional toll it may be taking. So in October, the eyes of the world once again turned to the Middle East and the horrific violence that has been unfolding in Israel-Palestine, including the Israeli military's relentless assault on Gaza. For years, stability has been misrepresented, especially in the West, as peace, not only in Israel-Palestine, but also in neighbouring Egypt. The United States and other Western governments are supporting stable authoritarian regimes in the region, trading arms for peace, often at great cost to local populations. Almost 68 million Egyptians were living on just $5.50 a day in 2020. President El-Sisi's government was spending $4 billion on defense and national security. Since his coup in 2013, President El-Sisi has ruled the country in an increasingly repressive fashion, while also receiving over $1 billion in military aid each year. Furthermore, a key US senator was recently indicted on corruption charges relating to Egypt. Bob Menendez and his wife are accused of accepting bribes in exchange for benefits to the Egyptian government, including foreign military sales and foreign military financing. Menendez had significant influence over those matters as the chair, and prior to that, as the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Next month in December, Egyptians will be taking to the polls for their presidential election. Predicted to be a sham election, the people's inability to stop Sisi from extending his reign to 2030 is likely to cause more unpredictability and uncertainty in Egypt's near future. The key question remains as to what these strategic partnerships, shaped in military sales, mean for the people of Egypt and the wider MENA region. So today our esteemed panelists, Dr. Nancy Akale, Dr. Shana Marshall, Mohammed Mandoor, who will be introduced further throughout the webinar, will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes on their areas of expertise around the topic, and we will follow up with a brief Q&A. So our first speaker, Dr. Nancy Akale, President and CEO at the Center for International Policy, is a distinguished scholar, policy analyst, and advocate with 2 decades of experience addressing human rights, democracy, and security in the Middle East and North Africa. She was a visiting scholar at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University, and she served as Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Her subsequent role as Director of Freedom House's Egypt program, Nancy was one of the 43 non-governmental organization workers convicted and sentenced to prison in a widely publicized 2012 case for allegedly using foreign funds to foment unrest in Egypt. She was exonerated by a court ruling in December of 2018. Nancy will talk on the political economy of the Egyptian military, corruption, and strategic partnership. Thanks, Nancy.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a privilege to be here among you all. And I'm a fan of everyone who is on the panel and of your work in particular, and the work of Ruth. And I can't even begin to say how important this work is on the issue of corruption in military at this particular moment. And I'm very grateful that we have people like you tracking this issue. I think given the complexity of the issues that are around us in the war in Gaza, in relation to what's happening in Egypt, it's a huge topic, but I want to narrow it down and bring it back to the basics. And I think there is a very tight and intertwined connection between corruption and national security. And I think national security has been the gift that keeps giving for any regime or military apparatus using the term national security. And I think this has become accentuated back after 9/11 and the war on terror. And I think the connection to corruption comes from three aspects of national security: its interpretation, its conceptualization, and the structure of national security. Well, the interpretation is that security is equated with the increase of arms and arms and strength of military power. And the security concept is reduced to this militaristic perspective, and this has led to the over-militarization globally, and but particularly in the Middle East. Now, conceptually, the whole idea is based on the concept of fear, and just people are afraid for their security from terrorism, from something out there that we identify. And once we do, we have a leeway in so many aspects of the issue of national security: how we buy arms, how we lack transparency, how we lack accountability. So in Egypt, going to that moment of after the Arab Spring and after the taking over of the military and post the coup in 2013, and the golden egg for the Egyptian military regime was this idea: the fear of Islamization, of terrorism, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they managed somehow by their control over the media to make all those terms synonymous with each other in the psyche and the perception of the Egyptian public and outside. Adding to that, later on, a couple of years or a year later, was the rise of ISIS in the region and the connection between groups in Sinai and them pledging allegiance to ISIS. I mean, this, of course, is giving what every military regime needs is the issue of legitimacy. Legitimacy of power, and legitimacy of increasing wealth, and legitimacy of asking for more arms, regardless whether their policies are effective or not. And whether, it is actually reducing the risk factor and security concerns and threats in the country. So this is how the regime of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi have framed it, and creating like this, umbrella of the fear of the Muslim Brotherhood, and under which, a lot of things came along. Now, this is the issue of the interpretation, and conceptually, once we have this established, a lot of things could be sacrificed for it, because this is the ultimate goal, is to have security. Now, when we have that, we could sacrifice freedom of the press, freedom of expression. We could have the legitimacy to hide, our military military sales and arms purchases and their reasons. Because again, it's an issue of national security. And that is not confined to Egypt. It's actually related to the relationship with the United States. The way we receive arms is through two main channels. One is the foreign military sales, which is the FMS, which is to a large extent could be tracked. But then there's the commercial sales, which is almost a black box, and it's very hard to track, not just in terms of knowing exactly how and why these arms are being purchased, but also everything that comes with it, including, for example, the military training that comes with commercial sales, that we don't know who's being trained for those arms. So all those circumstances, together, create the conceptual issue of the lack of transparency and lack of accountability structure of arms sales. Now, coming to corruption, in going back to the very point that when we started talking about the issue of the halal meat and the Menendez scandal, this is not far from it at all. Because, I mean, this has started when the Egyptian government decided to cancel the contracts of 7 companies or firms who were licensed to issue the certification of the halal meat. And give it to just one entity, which is this shadow or front company that is headed by Wael Hanna, who was the person who was dealing with the lawyers or the associates of Menendez later on. When there were questions, and this case did not start, I mean, this year or before, but it started like way ahead before that, when this decision was made. Well, first of all, in terms of benefit and the political economy of it, when this happened, when they canceled all the licenses and gave it to just one company, the price or the fees for the licensing of the meat went from $10 a ton to $250 a ton. So, I mean, I think those figures speak for themselves. When there is investigation started and people were trying to understand, I mean, just like this association with those shady lawyers that already have been under investigation. I mean, the justification that was given by the Egyptian government is that those other companies were headed by or owned by the Muslim Brotherhood, and for this, because this is a national security issue, they had to cancel it. So this is like a first, like very concrete example that sort of demonstrate and exemplifies is like how all those conceptualization of lack of transparency, fear of a certain threat could just manifest itself in things. I mean, as the case of the Menendez. Now, I mean, this is not a one-sided relationship. It takes two, and it's not, the two parties here are not just the Egyptian military and Senator Menendez, who were like, I mean, actually presiding over the foreign assistance decisions to Egypt, but it also goes back to the United States. I mean, if we think of the corruption is not just that issue, but there has to be a corrupting environment that allows for this. And the corrupting environment is that turning a blind eye on how these arms are being used, why are they purchased for, how security assistance is being utilized, and also, I mean, like how it is emboldening an authoritarian regime that has violated all forms of human rights in a way that even surpassed the situation under Mubarak. And what you see is that in every year, I mean, there is part of the security assistance to Egypt should be, I mean, conditioned, or it is conditioned on the human rights situation in the country. And with all the evidence that all civil society in the US and Egypt that provide this evidence, I mean, like that they cannot be denied. And by the Leahy laws means that the aid should be held. Then we find, I mean, a decision coming from the State Department to waive this condition for what? For security, I mean, for national security reasons. So just to, I mean, like I want to leave it for time to have a conversation and discuss this, but I just like wanted to like provide an image on how the interplay between corruption and the concept of national security is really the biggest threat for security.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nancy. Yeah, it's just from what you were saying, I think is you're obviously highlighting some of the biggest key questions around El-Sisi's leadership, not only his leadership, but also before looking at, you know, the timeline of things from the Arab Spring and, you know, the beginning of the war on terror and things, and how, you know, the different routes of arms sales are just hidden really behind this veil of national security and what it means to the people of Egypt. Yeah, very key questions, and thank you so much for speaking on that. Our next speaker is Dr. Shana Marshall. Shana is an Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and Assistant Research Professor at the George Washington University. Her dissertation, The New Politics of Patronage, the Arms Trade and Clientelism in the Arab World, examined how Middle East governments use arms sale agreements to channel financial resources and economic privileges to pro-regime elites. Shana was a fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University and the Nyhouse Center for Globalization and the Governance at Princeton University. Her current research focuses on patterns of military entrepreneurship in Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE. Shana's going to be talking about the contract behind the contract, offset contracts, and the role in forging corrupt relationships.
Okay, great. Thanks. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Yeah, so basically what my research has focused on, and very much is present in the case of Egypt and also many other countries across the world, are contracts called offset contracts, which are parallel or complementary agreements that are signed alongside major arms deals. They're not publicized. It's very difficult to find information about them, but I think they are the sort of the material basis for the vast majority of the corruption and bribery that is present in the arms trade. So for an example, if Lockheed Martin sells $100 million worth of equipment to Saudi Arabia, for example, Saudi Arabia will have a required offset amount of 30 or 60 or even 100% of the value of that original equipment contract. And the term offset comes from this idea that the procuring country would like the selling firm to offset this high cost of procuring their equipment by investing some of their funds in the procuring country's economy. So in the arms trade, this is typically in the form of technology transfer, right? The transfer of certain military defense technologies, manufacturing technologies into the procuring country's economy, or the co-production of specific items that are involved in the weapons system itself, or licensed production, such as the production of the M1A1 Abrams tank in Egypt, that has been a decades-long running agreement between General Dynamics, which is a US contractor, and the Egyptian military, and various other sort of forms of reverse investment, essentially. And when I started researching this, it seemed very illogical, because if a firm is investing 100% of the value of a contract that it's signing, how are they still some of the most profitable, largest revenue generating firms in the global economy, right? If they are asked to turn around and then invest all of their profits back into the procuring country, how are they making any money? And through literally years of research and talking to people in the industry, it became very clear that the firms actually inflate the cost of the material contract itself, typically by 100%, right? So if Lockheed, if the value of the material that they are selling to Saudi Arabia is actually $100 million, they will charge Saudi Arabia $200 million with the expectation that they will take a chunk of that to cover the offset requirement that Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Jordan or any really 90% of countries in the world have from defense export contracts. And so that essentially slush fund that is generated through this overcharging of the original equipment contract becomes the literal financial material basis for all of the bribes and the kickbacks that are associated, that come about as a result of that contract. So in Egypt in particular, because a lot of US military equipment sales to Egypt are financed through FMF, or foreign military financing, which is just the US term for its foreign military aid. For many years, the Egyptians did get offsets from that. And then sort of members of Congress started complaining, right? Because a lot of the production that had previously been occurring in their congressional districts was being transferred to Egyptian military factories, right? The case of the A1 Abrams tank is just sort of the most obvious. So I'll talk about that for a second. But this is the case sort of across the board. So General Dynamics essentially signed an agreement with the Egyptian military in the 80s to build a factory in Egypt where the Egyptian armed forces would be assembling the M1A1 Abrams tanks from kits that were shipped over from the United States, right? And what this does is it provides a lot of jobs and a lot of infrastructure and a lot of capital equipment and a lot of financing to the Egyptian armed forces as a result of that contract. And because the cost of the facility was so large and it involved the transfer of so much technology and so much equipment, it sort of locked in the continued export of those tank kits by General Dynamics. So it became a way for General Dynamics to sort of guarantee that every few years, the Egyptians would buy more and more of these tank kits, and that the US would approve export deals for those tank kits over and over and over again, to the point where the Egyptians ended up with like 1,200 of these tanks, which is way beyond, what any country would need to engage in any kind of land war. And they're also very large tanks. So they're not necessarily the kind of tanks that would be used in sort of a contemporary military confrontation. So this created a huge amount of sort of spillover for the Egyptian armed forces, which became the basis for a lot of commercial activity and commercial sales that the military then was able to take advantage of domestically. So the factory that was set up, the tank plant that was set up, now manufactures firefighting trucks that are sold to the government right under contract, earth movers, all kinds of heavy construction equipment trucks, as well as sort of luxury SUV cars that are then sold domestically on the domestic commercial market in Egypt. And so there's all of this sort of additional business opportunities and commercial opportunities that are generated for the Egyptian armed forces as a result of this initial offset contract, which was to co-produce or assemble these tanks domestically. And of course, the impact of that for the Egyptian sort of procurement system was that they were paying, 2-3 times more for this equipment than it would have cost them to just buy it off the shelf, right? So that money is coming from the central government budget of Egypt, but the benefits of that and of all of these sort of spillover production and manufacturing areas, all of that benefit accumulates just to the Egyptian armed forces, right? And this is a pattern that you see over and over again, really throughout the Egyptian armed forces economy. This is just the sort of American example, and the Americans actually did phase out offsets for the Egyptian military because it was considered double dipping, since they were using foreign military aid to buy these in the first place. Basically, Congress was like, you can't keep doing that. There are other countries that are still allowed to do that. Israel is the primary one, but you can see historically over time that those offset agreements become the basis for the buildup of domestic arms industry in countries that are major arms importers, right? So the UAE, which now has a substantial domestic military industry, Turkey, Greece, Israel, South Korea, a lot of these countries built up their indigenous arms industry using these offset contracts, transferring, technology, equipment, and all kinds of sort of manufacturing know-how through these offset contracts. And that allows for the military to really expand quite dramatically in the domestic economy. So although they're not doing that anymore with foreign military financing from the US, the Egyptians are doing a lot of it with France and Germany and Russia, because they don't get foreign military aid from those countries, right? They're spending Egyptian, public funds for the procurement of French and German and Russian weapon systems. But those countries, those European countries, are still extremely interested in partnering with the Egyptian military, not only because it's a huge procurement budget, and whether that's being financed by the Egyptians or whether the money is coming from Gulf states is sort of an open question. There are some cases, I know, the export of, I think, Russian tanks to Egypt, which also did include a plan for assembling and manufacturing those tanks domestically in Egyptian military factories. I think some of that financing quite clearly came from the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. But the aftermath of the coup, right, in 2013, the sort of the narrative around that was that there was going to be a drop off in foreign investment, right, in Egypt, because it was a military coup, right? It's gonna generate instability. We're going to see this massive drop off. But what you actually saw was a huge increase in European and Asian companies investing directly in partnership with the Egyptian armed forces, because it was very clear now that the Egyptian armed forces were in complete control of the government, right? So not only were they very willing to invest in Egypt, they were more willing to invest as partners directly with the Egyptian army. And that had the effect of militarizing a lot of the economy in Egypt, right? Because more and more of the actual manufacturing and the technologies were directed into military and security manufacturing. So it militarized the Egyptian economy, but it also made the regime of Sisi and the entire sort of military apparatus much more stable and in control of the political and economic system, because they could draw on these very robust relationships with these huge multinational firms from Europe and from Asia and from the Gulf states, right? So you see this sort of vicious cycle, right, of the military gaining more and more control over politics and the economy, and that being actually an attraction for these foreign firms, because they know that once they partner with the people who are in control of the entire politics and the economy, that they'll get follow-on contracts in the future. And so you've really seen, for example, Germany's, I think, had its largest, arms export year ever, right, in 2020, 2021, and that was primarily due to Egyptian contracts and Egyptian arms contracts that they were buying from the Germans. And you saw a very similar pattern with French weapons exports. And then most recently in 2022, you had a huge uptick in the amount of weapons that were being exported from the United States to Egypt, all in the midst of this continuing sort of financial crisis in Egypt, which, all of the leading international financial institutions are saying the Egyptians have to devalue their currency. They need to cut back on subsidies. They need to cut spending on all these social programs. They need to do this. They need to do that. And yet, right alongside all of these efforts to sort of cut government spending, you have this massive increase in spending on arms contracts and on military contracts. And so you can see that that becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the militarization of the economy, increasing public government resources being directed into that sector, and then that further strengthening the military's role in politics and the economy. I did want to talk briefly, because this is, an organization that's, primarily interested in conducting research on these issues, which is very difficult to do. But one of the things that I found to be really helpful is actually looking at business intelligence publications and sort of corporate filings, and quite frankly, sort of corporate PR literature, right? Because there's no central repository for the collection of information about offset contracts. The firms want to publicize them because it looks like they're investing in the domestic economy of the procuring country. So it makes them look like good partners, right? Even though we know, the general public doesn't know, but we know that what the firm is doing is overcharging the procuring country for the equipment in the first place, and then pocketing a lot of that difference. But they're advertising these contracts because it makes them look like they're engaged in sort of developing the domestic economy of these procuring countries. And so there's a lot of sort of PR literature. There's a lot of, public statements. There's a lot of very glossy, flyers and magazines and stuff that they develop around these programs, which is where you can actually find a lot of the concrete sort of empirical information. Because although technically in the US, firms are supposed to report what they're doing, the firms have lobbied the US government over time to restrict the amount of information that they have to report to the US government. And so now it's basically, we just see like one sort of top line dollar figure about all of the offset contracts that US military firms are signing with procuring countries. And so it makes it very difficult to know what projects are going where and who's benefiting from those projects. But if you can sort of drill down into, one publication that I've used a lot is Intelligence Online, which is basically just sort of a gossip rag, I guess, for like multinational corporations and their operations in the global South. But it's been really super helpful for me. There's something called the Counter Trade and Offset newsletter. These are all very expensive publications to subscribe to, right? Because it's basically corporations sort of subscribing to them to find out what their competitors are doing in terms of these complementary contracts. And they don't want the public to generally sort of know about this stuff. But if you can get somebody to foot the bill for it, the information is out there, and it makes it very clear sort of who's benefiting from these contracts domestically and how they're reshaping domestic politics and the way the economy operates in these major procuring countries. And I'm happy to talk about, any of that kind of stuff during the Q&A. Is that helpful? Okay.
Thank you so much, Shana. Well, for somebody that works in an organization focusing on arms trade issues, specifically around corruption, I realize how hard it is to actually describe offsets, and especially to the general public and things like that. Thanks for doing it in such a detailed but also clear manner. So it's really interesting how these offsets basically are just conducted through the complete inflation of contracts, leading to slush funds, and as you say, the militarization of the economy, even
the procuring country officials, even who are signing these agreements, cannot see that inflated contract cost, right? Because there will be a top line item, right? The big budget item at the top, and that's where that inflation of the equipment dollar value goes, right? But it literally, there are all kinds of US government sort of regulatory documents that basically prohibit people who work in the US government, contracting officials, prohibit them from sharing information, if they happen to have it, about the nature of whether offset costs were included in the contract, the initial equipment contract cost, right? Because it's been very clear over time that procuring country officials are starting to are catching on to this, right? And so they're saying, wait, tell us what the actual give us an official cost estimate, and then leave the offset out. And firms will refuse to do that. And so they've lobbied the US government to make it increasingly impossible for anyone who's actually, because of course, when the US government approves these sales, the US government itself is acting as the agent for the foreign procuring country, right? They are the ones who are supposed to ensure that the contract is fair and that the costs and the prices are legitimate, right? They are the ones who are responsible for doing that. And it was increasingly difficult for them to do that when they knew that offsets were being included. And so basically, the defense industry has lobbied to make it impossible for those contracting agents to sort of see what's happening within the broader contract. And if they happen to know one way or another, has prohibited them from sharing that information with procuring country governments, which is, part of the reason why these firms are so incredibly profitable and have such enormous revenues, because they're able to get away with stuff like this.
Yeah, and the fact that so many countries are able to get away with it as well. Even I think this, you highlighted in your presentation how many countries actually export to Egypt. But also this week, Fincantieri just signed a 10-year contract, I think, for 260 million euro maintenance contract for 2 frigates. So that's a 10-year strategic partnership right there.
And it gives them a regional hub for more exports, right, to the rest of the Middle East and Africa, right? So for the firms, it's a win-win situation, really.
Exactly. All right, thanks, Jana. So on to our next speaker now, Mohamed Mandoor. He's an independent expert who has been recognized as an emerging expert for the Forum on the Arms Trade, focusing on US military assistance to the MENA region and arms and emerging technology trade policies. His research interests include exile activism, transnational repression, and digital repression in the MENA region. Mohamed previously worked as a Bassem Sabri Research Fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, where his article on Egyptian exile activism ranked among the top 10 articles of 2022. Welcome, Mandoor.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be among this amazing scholar and speaking on this panel. So my research has focused mainly on exile activism and transnational repression, and I will try to find the link between exile activism and transnational repression and US-Egypt security relationship. So starting from 2013 in Egypt, when Sisi regime reached to power, we have witnessed an unprecedented wave of crackdown on universities, on human rights organizations, on political parties, on generally the Egyptian civil society. So this has prompted so many Egyptian activists, scholars, journalists, and human rights defenders to leave the country and try to continue their activism from exile. Others, some of them left because they were deeply targeted by the Egyptian regime, so legal cases, and others left because they weren't able to continue their research or their work or their activism. Some of them specifically moved to the US, and when they reached here to the US, started thinking about what are the tools that they can use, given that they are here in the US, they can use to influence the political situation in Egypt. What kind of leverage that the US has over Egypt, so they can urge the US government and the US officials to use this kind of leverage to prioritize human rights and democracy in Egypt. Definitely, the first thing they relied on is the US security assistance to Egypt. So we have seen we have seen a lot of advocacy initiatives conducted by Egyptian human rights organizations in exile, Egyptian scholars, in cooperation with other US organizations to urge the Congress to withhold or condition part of US security assistance to Egypt. In 2017, for example, the US government withheld a portion of US security assistance to Egypt on 3 conditions. One of them related to the 2017 NGO law, the case 173, the case of foreign funding to Egyptian civil society, and also cooperation and security partnership with North Korea. After the US did that, Egypt actually acquitted Americans in this case 173, and totally it changed the law with a new one was enacted in 2019. So for Egyptian, it was a kind of a success story that we can use this leverage and we can continue to advocate the US government to put condition in US security assistance, so we can have some sort of influence on the situation in Egypt, and we can introduce some sort of reform or enhancing the human rights conditions in Egypt. Having Biden as a president of the United States also increases the hopes of the Egyptians in exile, given that democracy and human rights will be in the center of the US foreign policy making. And in the last 2 years, we have seen a portion of US security assistance to Egypt was withheld by the State Department and the Congress, and this pressured the Egyptian regime to release some activists from prison, lawyers like Muhammad al-Baqir, activists like Ahmed Doma, people who lived in prison for years. But also the Egyptian regime relied to other tools in order to counter exile activism from Egyptian. So if Egyptians are trying, or Egyptians in exile are trying to urge the US government to prioritize human rights and democracy in its relationship with the US, the Egyptian regime is using some tools to deprioritize the human rights and democracy in US-Egypt relationship. So one of the tools that the Egyptian regime has relied on, and starting from even 2014, is diversifying its arms sales from other countries, including Russia, including France, including Italy, and having this country as a top sellers to Egypt instead of the US, and actually using the US security assistance to Egypt as a kind of indirect funding to purchase this arms sales from this country. So the US will feel that our money is going to other countries. One of them is Russia, a strategic enemy for the US, and we are losing Egypt. So that's why we need to keep sending Egypt the same US security assistance. We need also to allow Egypt to purchase whatever it needs from arms sales. The other tool that was used is using the Egypt-Israeli relationship, and in some cases we have seen Israelis advocating for Egypt and the Egyptian government to continue in front of the US government to continue the security assistance to Egypt. But other tool we just discovered recently is corruption, which is a language that the Egyptian regime is aware of how to use it, and it's silver bullet, how you can basically involve US policymakers, US officials, as a Senate member like Menendez in this process through corruption, so we can keep the US security assistance, and we can counter, on other hand, the advocacy attempts that's committed by the Egyptians in exile. Another tool that the Egyptian regime has used to counter exile activism is through transnational repression, which is basically targeting Egyptians in exile, or targeting their family members back home, or spreading their spreading the Egyptian regime surveillance over Egyptians in exile in order to transfer the same mode of governance that's happening in Egypt to Egyptians in exile. We are watching you. We can reach you at any time. What happened to Khashoggi is not very far from what we can do. And we have seen actually several attempts by the Egyptian regime to target Egyptian Americans in the US and outside of the US. One prominent case when Mohammed Sultan, the Egyptian American activist, sued Hazem al-Pahlawi, his family members back in Egypt were arrested. And another case, we have seen Egyptian American activist Sharif Osman, when he was visiting UAE during COP27 last year, he was arrested in UAE. So Egyptian request, and spent like 40 days in prison, and then was released. We also have seen as the FBI 2 years ago arresting an Egyptian agent, an Egyptian spy in the US, in New York, spying on Egyptian activists and Egyptian human rights defender. So however, we have seen all of these cases. We haven't seen any Egyptian official held accountable for these cases, for harming US citizens. And the main reason and the main justification that always Egyptian activists are receiving from US policymakers, we cannot threaten Egypt-US relationship, especially the security partnership for this. So Egypt also used this security partnership, this relationship, to avoid any sort of accountability and to signal message for impunity for its officials. We have seen at least people who were involved in Khashoggi murder being sanctioned, being the US government used Khashoggi ban against them, but we have never seen any Egyptian official who were involved in the same action, transnational repression against distance, being held accountable. And lastly, we have seen the Egyptian regime is using spyware to target Egyptian dissidents in exile and Egyptian dissidents also in home. And this spyware predator is one of the countries that was blacklisted by the US government, by the Department of Commerce. So we are seeing basically, if the US is continuing allowing to the Egyptian regime to use its financial resources to purchase more arms sales. So now the Egyptian regime is keeping its own financial resources for repression, for repressing the Egyptians in exile and in home. So basically, this partnership has signaled a message to Egyptians at home that the US is supporting an autocratic regime that's always harassing them, spreading crackdown. However, we have seen a different rhetoric about centering human rights and democracy in US-Egypt relationship, or in general in US foreign policy making, and signals the same message to Egyptians in exile that even if you are in the US, you are not safe, and the US government will not hold these Egyptian officials accountable because they are partners. The same agency that is in negotiation with the US government regarding security assistance, or the same agencies that actually send corruption to Menendez, is the same agency who hired this spy and asked him to spy on Egyptians in exile. So we cannot lose this, or this is a US mind or the US logic. We cannot lose this relationship for Egyptians in exile or Egyptians in the US. And they are not only Egyptians, they are Americans, this citizen. And you can see now how prioritizing this US-Egypt security partnership is in another way harming US national security, because you have agents here working in the US, spying on people, and the FBI only arrested people who were like spying. But what about the officials? What about people who give them orders, give them money, give them resources, and ask them to spy on specific people? So this process is continuing. Yes, we arrested one, but we don't know how many others are still working. They might be watching us now or watching other people. We don't know. So the main thing is, from my research, is trying to ask Egyptians in exile, is you cannot really for the Egyptian government, for the American government, you can really talk about centering human rights and democracy in your foreign policy without reforming U.S. security partnership, without redefining what is national security for you, and what are your priorities in the region, and what are your priorities in terms of U.S.-Egypt relationship. I will stop here, and I'm happy to join the conversation with the Q&A.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks a lot. Yeah, this is something obviously that I don't know too much about, is a lot of the activism from those either in Egypt or that have been exiled. But you talking about some of the successes that you've seen has been really great. How they can pressure the Egyptian government and also the US government. But yeah, mostly what I take away is the different tools that the Egyptian regime uses, and why these strategic partnerships are so important, so that none of the government officials or politicians or military leaders actually are held accountable in the end. So thanks a lot for that. I just want to remind people that for any attendees, anybody that wants to ask some questions in the Q&A, can you kindly put those in the chat? We're going to enter a little bit of a discussion or Q&A now. We have a few questions come through, and I think because they are kind of personalized, I think maybe we would ask specific speakers to speak on different questions. So if you don't mind, I think we'll start with Nancy. And one of the questions, or unless you have something to say as well about it, then that would also be great. So the first one for Nancy would be, so on the Menendez case, on the halal meat scandal, what would you say to the hypothetical claim that Menendez was just a bad seed versus military corruption? So maybe you can expand a little bit more on the military corruption of the El-Sisi regime and the military sort of regime in Egypt.
Thank you so much for this question. And actually, it's just like I was enjoying like the contribution, Hamad and Shana, because they're all pieces of the puzzle. I mean, they complement like the picture of understanding why, despite the clarity of how problematic, I mean, arms sales and military and security assistance are, it is so hard to challenge. Even when we have like a stark, obvious case, like when we're seeing with the case of Menendez. And again, if you just like the case of Menendez is just like a symptom of a bigger problem. And yes, okay, I'm just like that. No one should or could claim that this is representative of all U.S. senators or U.S. Congress, actually, but there is sort of an overall framing of how U.S. is supporting military and also and by doing that, because the military is in power, you are supporting authoritarian regimes in Egypt and the Middle East, and again, like, I don't want this to be confined to just like one bad apple, because the issue of scrutinizing how this military aid is being used, how defense budgets are being utilized internally within Egypt is a complete black box. And Shana's examples of the offset contracts is just like only just one part of the different and wider dynamics through which the Egyptian military are able to enrich themselves. And just like to give you an example of like how the national budget works and how the military is able to both directly and indirectly enrich itself through that, is that when you have like the national budget, let's say allocating $100 million to the Ministry of Education to build schools. Now, the budget is allocated as such. Then, when it comes to the construction of those schools, the military intervenes to just sort of have the control over to prevent corruption, and intervenes to be the main contractors of it, and subcontracting the private sector to do that. And by doing that, they also identify the margin of revenue that the private sector goes, then the rest of the money goes back to the military. So this is how, like, there are different internal dynamics that leads to that. But also on the external dynamic, on the foreign relations part, the elephant in the room is the industrial military complex. And the relationship between the industry itself. I mean, the examples that Shanna gave us, like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and others, and the relationship with the campaign financing of US senators and congressmen. And this is how it's very difficult, although it's stipulated in US, Constitution and US laws. We have the Leahy laws that prohibits, the US from sending or supporting arms sales to a country that is violating human rights. And it's very clear. And it's very clear to have that, to prove that it never happens. And although the US Congress have the authority to stop any sales, it has never been able to do that until today. And that's why, there was a movement in the US which was called like flip the script. So instead of the Congress having the right to stop the sales, is flipping it that the Congress have to approve any sale of arms unless in a certain threshold. Of course, this is very hard to implement, again, because of like this whole vicious circle and cycle of the military industrial complex, and now it's like the military industrial congressional and media complex, because they're all part of one thing. Also, like the issue of exceptionalism, and I think I really appreciate Amir's mention of that. There's also this exceptionalism within countries, but also exceptionalism across the Middle East. And right now, like we cannot ignore while we're talking about conditioning of aid and the relationship of the industrial military complex. Sorry, losing my words, because I'm just about to speak about Israel. That's very difficult. And we're seeing, right now, the supplementary aid package that is being proposed for Israel. And there is a strong call to condition aid to, the observant of human rights, international humanitarian law, and there's a resistance to do that. Although this would not be something that is being added, it is actually abiding by US domestic laws. However, with the exceptionalism of the treatment of Israel, there is like this huge, just like power that is blocking that from happening. And this is going back to answer your question about the Menendez case. The Menendez case, yes, this is an indication of one corrupt individual. This one corrupt individual operates in a universe that is conducive of corruption and is conducive of exceptionalism. And once you have this exceptionalism, there are countries and militaries that are above the law, above their own laws, and above the international humanitarian law, and above US domestic laws. So this is what creates this problem. And thank you for asking this question, because once we start treating the Menendez case as this one exceptional case, one corrupt person, we're missing the plot. We're missing really the huge issue that we need to address, is both, not just the dynamics of US arms sales or security assistance towards the Middle East and globally, but also its structure and also its framing. and the framing of arms for peace that is actually been, the background of all what we have seen, the problematic, Abraham Accords for the normalization between Israel and different Gulf countries, which was coming close right before October 7th, where the US was, proceeding towards a US-Saudi defense deal that is all about, an arms sales to Saudi Arabia that was sugar-coated with calling it a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But at the heart of it, this was all about this. And as we saw, a few days, just into this, we're seeing what's happening now, because these deals are not sustainable, and they're not useful, and they are not leading to peace, because again, as the title of this workshop is, the confusion between the concept of peace and stability and stagnation as well.
Thank you, Nancy. And further to that, on to our next question, I'm wondering, as arms trade research expert in terms of Shana and Mohammed, what would happen if the US decided to cut military aid?
I think that they won't do that, because it's so central and important to the firms themselves, which are extremely influential in US domestic politics, right? The foreign military aid is just a subsidy to domestic US defense contractors, right? And it's become so ingrained and so critical to such a number of, again, extremely influential sort of behemoth, conglomerates in the US, which have, hundreds of millions of dollars for, lobbying budgets, and, have their congressional representatives on speed dial and can always get meetings with them. And then, of course, will end up giving, seats on their boards of directors and foundations and stuff to those same members of Congress as soon as they retire, which is where Menendez went wrong, right? His corruption was, in situ corruption, which is just not acceptable. You're just supposed to wait till you're finished and then you sort of cash out. That I don't think that the US government will ever successfully dial back any of that military assistance that goes to Egypt, because it's in such demand by US defense contractors, unless there's direct action against some of the factories in the United States, which we've seen a lot in the UK in the context of the war on Gaza, right? Activists shutting down factories that are producing weapons that are being sent to Israel. And also in Boston in the United States, there are a number of factories that produce weapon systems, including Israeli-owned U.S. subsidiaries of Israeli-owned firms that have been, shut down by activists. If we see a lot of that, and can really actually weaken the military-industrial complex in the United States, weaken their hold on politics, then that might be sort of an entry point for something like that. But of its own accord, I do not think the US government will ever successfully sort of use military aid as leverage, to get any sort of change from the Egyptian government or the Israeli government, unfortunately.
Can I just have a two-finger interjection there? Canceling the whole aid, is a big issue, but it does make a difference when there is a political will to use it. And in the case of the case 173, the only reason that we got acquitted was that because the U.S. had $195 million from military aid, and because of that, we got acquitted. And I think there is the concept of the value of this amount compared to $1.3 billion. it's insignificant, but for the Egyptian government, it is symbolically significant. the fact that Egypt is being punished somehow, no matter how small this amount is, does matter. So I think that there is a value of considering like the aid conditionality and using aid as a tool, but I fully agree with Shannon. It's like just the bigger issue of like military aid in itself. I mean, towards Egypt, and of course we cannot just like stop aid to Egypt while we're still giving aid to military aid to Israel. I mean, it's like the questions of balance of power and the deal, and that's why the problem starts with the point of the Arms for Peace framing. That is basically, I mean, the background of all these accords and peace deals and peace agreements.
One thing also I would like to add, definitely agree with Nancy and Shanna, but also looking at the current political situation, the current war between Gaza and Israel, this means that the importance of Egypt to US policymaker is constantly increasing. And while like some scholars and researchers like arguing like, we can say like 3 weeks ago that Egypt is no longer important. The US is moving to have this kind of partnership between Israel and the Gulf. So there is opportunity for withholding more military assistance from Egypt. Now, Egypt is one of the most important players when it comes to protecting Israeli national security. Egypt has been a mediator between Israel and Hamas, and also with the support of Qatar, or in cooperation with Qatar. So now it's not the time to talk or to speak or even to do any sort of advocacy with senators and congress members regarding cut in the US security assistance. However, literally a few weeks ago, Senator Cardin was like promising to withhold $300 million from the US security assistance to Egypt. Now, no one is talking about this, and actually we might see that the conditions moving from democracy and human rights to receiving some of people in Gaza, or being part of a larger deal regarding hosting some of refugees coming from Gaza. So there are also a discourse around how this 1.3 military assistance to Egypt, or how US assistance to Egypt in general can be used to serve the current US goals that's moved from, we started with human rights and democracy in the center, then partnership between Israel and the Gulf countries, and now it's only Israeli national security is the main priority for the US now. So with this change, we will see a change on the priorities of US foreign policy that will be reflected on the US security assistance and the conditions associated with this assistance.
Thank you so much, Mandel. Mohammed, sorry for the lapse of time. Is anybody keen to speak next on this issue before we wrap up?
Well, go ahead.
No.
I would just say that if we actually got real democracy in the US, that would probably help, support democracy elsewhere in the world. I mean, there is no relationship between the preferences of US voters and the laws that get passed by representatives. They've done multiple sort of large N time series studies to examine whether or not the preferences of voters actually get transformed into politics. And there is no relationship in the US. There is no relationship between those things. This is not a democracy, right? This political system does not function like a democracy. The example of US support for a ceasefire, right? It's extraordinarily high. And yet there's, a handful of representatives that are supporting a ceasefire. If we had a genuinely democratic system in the US and a genuinely democratic foreign policy system, then the policies and the actions of the US vis-a-vis other countries would be, 180 degrees from what they are now. And that would support the development of democracy in other countries, because as we've seen, the vast majority of what the US government does abroad does not support democracy. And so, yeah, if we had democracy here, I think it would help promote democracy elsewhere.
Just on a surprisingly, I'm going to end on a positive note, and I think there is an increasing positive awareness of the implications of the defense industry. And there is a huge effective movement over the past 3 years in the UN on the due diligence, the human rights due diligence of the defense industry. And it is being effective slowly but surely, because the industry is realizing how much this could immediately hurt them financially in their ability to even continue to extend their loans and also protect themselves from lawsuits. It's not like a major force right now, but it is increasing. And I was just at a defense conference 2 months ago, and one of the high-level executive of one of the big defense industry told me, after we spoke in a panel on compliance and also complicity of the defense industry in the atrocities that happens and the use of weapons, because there's always this shield between who uses the weapons and the interest and the benefit that goes to the industry. And so long as the accountability is only restricted or directed towards the countries and governments and not the defense industry itself, we will not be able to break away from that structure. But the good news is, this executive told me, is your presentation made me so uncomfortable, because this is not how we think about being complicit. And it's because we also gave examples that are beyond the defense industry, like cases like Lafarge in Syria. But he said, in the past, people used to be just happy being employed at such a prestigious firm with very high salaries. Right now, the younger employees and the younger members are pushing so hard and asking us questions on how are the arms being used, why, who are we selling those arms are. So I think, things have changed, and it's changing dramatically, but slowly but surely. And it's that, and even when we're talking about Shanna talking about there is an overwhelming, support for a ceasefire, but is not reflected yet. And I think a big part of this is due to the awareness of the younger generation, and their principled ways of seeing the world and pushing back. And it's hearing this from a high executive in a defense industry, getting worried from internal questioning and accountability of their own employees. I think this is positive. And to answer your questions about what can be done, I think it's continuing that pressure, because there is, an audience out there who needs to use this information and put pressure, whether within the industry and also internationally, as we're seeing right now with the UN and the movement that has been growing over the past 3 years.
Thanks, Nancy. Mohammed, did you want to touch up on that before we wrap up? Or?
Yeah, I think I will be a bit pessimistic against what Nancy just said. I think maybe I'm completely impacted by the current moment, but I think the current moment is very heavy on all of us, and also on activists and on human rights organizations, that's on news that they are calling for a reforming of US Egypt relationship, or calling for ceasefire. We have seen a shift on the priorities of the US towards the Middle East starting of October 7. We have seen also some donors are restricting their fund to civil society in the Middle East and to human rights organizations. We have seen senators and Congress members are shifting their priorities and thinking that democracy and human rights in the Middle East is not a priority right now. We have other priorities. Also, from the perspective of the activists and of the human rights organizations in the Middle East, we have seen this government that we are always urging them to pressure our regimes to adopt human rights and democracy, are violating international human rights law, are complicit in an ongoing genocide. So actually, it will be heavy to go to same people who are providing funding to an ongoing genocide and asking them to reform US-Egypt relationship or to pressure the Egyptian regime towards releasing some of the activists. I think what's happening right now is gonna impact this relationship that was established through years between human rights organizations and activists and US officials, and the coming outputs is not in favor of democracy and human rights. I think Sisi now is acting as someone who has a blank check, a new one starting from October 7, giving the importance of Egypt. Yesterday, we have seen Madam Masr, editor-in-chief Lina Atallah, going to the prosecution. We have seen all the supporters, or most of some supporters of Ahmad Tantawi being arrested. He himself might face illegal penalties or going to jail. So instead of like literally two months ago, the Egyptian regime was constantly releasing some activists, we have seen like a kind of a counter attack from the Egyptian regime on the Egyptian civil society, home and in exile. So I don't, to be clear, the implications of this ongoing war on the Egyptian civil society and human rights is going to be really bad and really hard, and need from us to think about different modes of solidarity that's not directed or urging the US policymakers to do something, because I don't think they will do anything in the coming few months at least. And thank you.
Different perspectives, that's what we're here for. Yeah, so firstly, sorry to everybody for running over about 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And thanks to the wonderful speakers. I've genuinely learned so much from all of you, so thank you. I'm not just saying that. And we'll do a social media drive. We'll try and get this started. But yeah, thank you all so much. I guess we'll wrap up here. Unless you guys want to say anything else. And everyone can have a great day or night wherever you are. And yeah, thanks.